Little Brother's Revenge, the most heartwarming twist you'll see. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. I looked my ruined, sobbing older brother in the eye and told him I owned him now. We were standing in the sterile, glass-walled boardroom of his former corporate headquarters. The massive mahogany table between us was supposed to be a powerful symbol of his immense wealth, but today, it was simply the cold altar where his perfect life was being aggressively dismantled. Julian, 32 years old and usually dressed in bespoke Italian suits that cost more than my entire car, was wearing a wrinkled, stained button-down. His hands were shaking so violently he had to keep them pressed flat against the expensive wood. Beside him sat Vance, his slick, 40-something business partner, wearing an expression of practiced, tragic sympathy. Vance gently patted Julian's shoulder, perfectly playing the role of the supportive friend watching a horrible tragedy unfold. But I knew the actual truth. I stood on the opposite side of the long table, dressed in my usual uniform of faded jeans and a dark gray hoodie, tightly holding a thick manila folder. Inside that heavy folder was the legal deed to Julian's luxury penthouse, the title loans on his vehicles, and the controlling shares of his bankrupt tech logistics firm. I was 24, a self-taught cybersecurity freelancer who lived in a chaotic basement apartment filled with empty energy drink cans and glowing monitors. For my entire life, Julian had treated me like a useless parasite, a profound failure who refused to grow up and get a real job. He was the family's golden child, the Ivy League prodigy who never missed an opportunity to remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. Today, our dynamic was permanently reversed. I watched his chest heave with panicked breaths as he stared at the legal documents proving that I was the sole architect of his financial destruction. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his dry throat. But getting to this boardroom took the most ruthless betrayal of my entire life. To understand exactly how we ended up in that glass room, you have to deeply understand the toxic dynamic that defined our entire existence. Julian was 8 years older than me, which meant he was already winning prestigious academic awards by the time I was learning how to tie my shoes. My parents absolutely worshipped the ground he walked on. He was the polished, arrogant, tightly wound corporate machine who always did exactly what was expected of him. He got the elite business degree, started the logistics firm, and bought the massive downtown penthouse. I, on the other hand, was just Toby. I spent my teenage years teaching myself Python, hanging out on obscure hacker forums, and taking freelance cybersecurity bounties online. My bedroom was a permanent mess of tangled Ethernet cables and soldering irons. Julian intensely despised everything about me. He viewed my unconventional life as a personal insult to his rigid, wealthy worldview. The ultimate breaking point happened just a month before the collapse, at our mother's 60th birthday dinner. I had just finished a massive security audit for a mid-sized firm and was actually feeling genuinely proud of myself. When my mom asked how my work was going, Julian didn't even let me answer. He laughed, took a sip of his ridiculously expensive wine, and said, "Toby doesn't work, Mom. He plays on his computer while adults build actual wealth. It's embarrassing." The entire table went dead silent. My mom looked down at her plate, too intimidated by Julian's financial success to ever dare correct him. I felt my face burn with intense humiliation, my hands balling into tight fists under the table. I wanted to scream, to show them my bank statements, to prove I wasn't just some basement-dwelling loser. But I knew it wouldn't matter. In Julian's eyes, if you didn't have a corner office, you were completely worthless. I shoved my chair back, threw a $50 bill on the table for my meal, and walked out of the restaurant without saying another word. I just swallowed my anger, completely unaware that his perfect facade was already cracking. A few weeks after that disastrous birthday dinner, I started noticing the deep, alarming cracks in Julian's supposedly bulletproof armor. It began with small, uncharacteristic things. Julian, the man who lived and died by his color-coded Google Calendar, suddenly ghosted our parents for 3 consecutive Sunday dinners. When my mother asked him about it, he claimed he was just swamped with an upcoming corporate merger, but his voice on the phone sounded incredibly hollow and strained. Then came the terrifying incident at the steakhouse. It was our father's retirement celebration, and Julian had insisted on taking everyone to the most obnoxiously expensive restaurant in the entire downtown district. He ordered a ridiculous, showy spread, massive tomahawk steaks, vintage wine, the absolute works. He spent the entire dinner nervously checking his smartwatch, bouncing his leg under the table with manic, unhinged energy. When the astronomical bill finally arrived, Julian confidently dropped his exclusive Black American Express card onto the leather tray. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned, looking incredibly uncomfortable. He leaned down and quietly whispered that the card had been declined. Julian's face instantly turned a shade of crimson I had never seen before. He violently exploded. He yelled at the poor waiter, blaming a massive bank error, causing a huge scene in the middle of the quiet dining room. To quickly cover his intense embarrassment, he immediately pivoted to violently attacking me. "Well, I'd asked Toby to chip in," he sneered loudly, swiping a different card from his wallet. "But we all know his fake internet job barely covers his hot pockets." My parents nervously chuckled, desperately trying to diffuse the immense, suffocating tension. I didn't laugh. I just stared at my older brother. Beneath his tailored jacket, he was sweating profusely. His eyes were totally bloodshot, darting around the room like a trapped, panicked animal. The trademark arrogance was still there, but it was fragile, performing a desperate balancing act over an abyss of pure panic. I didn't say anything to him then, but my deeply ingrained hacker instincts were screaming on absolute high alert. I knew the arrogant jerk was hiding something massive, and I needed to know what. 2 days after the bizarre restaurant incident, I desperately needed to retrieve an expensive portable hard drive I had foolishly left at Julian's place a month prior. I knocked on the heavy oak door of his downtown penthouse. He answered wearing a bathrobe, looking absolutely, incredibly terrible. He had dark, heavy bags under his eyes, and the apartment, usually impeccably clean thanks to his expensive maid service, was cluttered with empty coffee cups and scattered mail. He grunted rudely, told me the drive was on his desk, and immediately disappeared into the bathroom to take a shower. I walked into his home office, a sterile room dominated by glass and expensive chrome. As I grabbed my hard drive, I instinctively glanced at his personal wireless router. Call it a professional defect, but I always violently notice bad network security. I realized with absolute shock that his home network, despite him running a massive tech logistics company, was completely unsecured. It was practically begging to be compromised by anyone with a keyboard. I sat in his expensive leather chair and opened my laptop. It only took me 3 minutes of basic IP sniffing to see what traffic was actively moving across his home network. I wasn't trying to steal anything. I just wanted to see if his expensive devices were infected with malicious malware. Instead, I saw a pop-up notification appear on his unlocked iPad sitting right next to the keyboard. It was an email preview from his head of corporate accounting. The subject line was in bold red caps: "Urgent, final overdraft notice, payroll bouncing." The preview text below, it was even worse, desperately pleading with Julian to authorize emergency funds because the IRS was threatening to freeze the entire corporate structure by Friday morning. Before I could read any further, Julian walked into the room, aggressively toweling off his wet hair. I slammed my laptop shut and shoved the hard drive into my backpack, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. He gave me a disgustingly dirty look and told me to get out of his house. The notification vanished instantly, but it was enough to make my blood run completely cold. I sprinted back to my basement apartment, my racing mind running through 100 different, terrifying worst-case scenarios. My roommate and closest friend, Maya, was sitting on our battered couch eating cheap ramen. She was 24, a deeply cynical but fiercely loyal hacker who understood complex data structures significantly better than anyone I had ever met. I dropped my backpack on the floor, immediately booted up my main desktop rig, and told her exactly what I had seen on Julian's unlocked iPad. Maya immediately dropped her noodles and pulled her rolling chair over to my primary workstation. We spent the next 14 hours locked in a relentless, exhausting deep dive, scraping public financial records, cross-referencing corporate tax filings, and quietly probing the outer digital defenses of Julian's company servers. What we found was absolutely, undeniably horrifying. Julian's massive logistics company wasn't just experiencing a temporary cash flow hiccup. It was fundamentally, catastrophically gutted. The company was actively hemorrhaging millions of dollars into a dark black hole of unpayable debt. We found multiple silent IRS liens permanently filed against the company's primary operational assets. The federal government was preparing to heavily drop the hammer, and my arrogant brother was literally weeks away from a massive indictment for millions in unpaid corporate taxes. But as Maya highlighted the transfer logs from the last 3 quarters, she pointed out a glaring, terrifying anomaly on my secondary monitor. "Look at the disbursement patterns, Toby," she said, sharply tapping her pen against the glass screen. "These aren't operational losses. This money is being actively funneled out of the main operational accounts in highly structured, incremental bursts." I leaned in closer, carefully tracing the digital pathways. The massive funds were being routed through 3 different domestic shell companies before disappearing entirely into an untraceable digital void. Julian was a lot of things: arrogant, extremely rude, completely obsessed with his public image, but he wasn't a sophisticated criminal mastermind. He literally didn't have the technical expertise to orchestrate a data laundering scheme this incredibly complex. The sheer volume of the missing capital was absolutely staggering, enough to completely bankrupt him 10 times over. The financial math didn't add up, which meant someone inside was actively cooking the books. We spent the next 3 exhaustive days living on nothing but stale coffee and pure adrenaline, aggressively tracking the stolen money through the vast digital ether. I wrote a custom, highly complex script to trace the IP packets associated with the fraudulent transfer authorizations. The digital breadcrumbs led us completely away from Julian's corporate office and straight to a series of heavily encrypted offshore accounts securely located in the Cayman Islands. Maya cracked her knuckles, typed furiously, and somehow managed to pull the encrypted digital signature attached to the last 5 massive cash transfers. The authorizations didn't belong to my older brother. They belonged entirely to Vance. Vance was Julian's slick, highly charismatic business partner, a 40-something corporate veteran who had supposedly mentored Julian through his early 20s. He was always at our family events, smiling with his expensive porcelain veneers and patting Julian on the back. It turned out Vance was systematically bleeding the entire company completely dry. He was exploiting a complex legal loophole in their original partnership agreement, siphoning the vital operational capital into his private offshore shells. He cleverly doctored the internal ledgers and even routed some of the fake invoices through Julian's personal network to ensure the federal agents would find a massive smoking gun directly on my brother's devices. Vance was meticulously setting my brother up to take the absolute massive fall for the missing millions. When the IRS finally raided the glass building, Vance would play the innocent, deeply betrayed partner, while Julian would be looking at a minimum of 20 brutal years in a federal penitentiary. The sheer, calculated malice of the plan left me entirely, breathlessly speechless. I stared at the glowing lines of green code on my monitor, realizing that my older brother, despite all his Ivy League education and intense corporate bravado, was nothing more than a highly naive pawn in a sociopath's deadly game. He was completely, tragically blind to the massive knife poised directly over his exposed back. Vance was packing a golden parachute while strapping my brother to a ticking financial bomb. Armed with a thick, heavy folder of undeniably damning evidence, I marched straight to Julian's massive corporate headquarters the very next morning. I aggressively bypassed the protesting receptionist, ignoring her threats to call security, and shoved my way directly into his expansive corner office. Julian was pacing frantically behind his huge mahogany desk, violently yelling at someone on his mobile phone. When he saw me standing there, he slammed the phone down, his exhausted face twisting into an ugly, familiar mask of pure rage. "What the hell are you doing here, Toby?" he snapped violently, adjusting his expensive tie with visibly shaking hands. "I absolutely do not have time for your childish, pathetic nonsense today." I completely ignored his harsh insult and slammed the heavy folder of packet traces and offshore bank statements onto his pristine, organized desk. I desperately begged him to look at the documents. I explained, speaking as quickly and clearly as I could, that Vance was systematically embezzling the company's funds and actively framing him for catastrophic tax evasion. I naively thought the concrete, mathematical proof would instantly snap him out of his delusion. Instead, it aggressively triggered his deepest, most toxic insecurities. Julian viciously refused to even open the folder. He laughed a harsh, wildly desperate laugh and loudly called me a paranoid, intensely jealous basement dweller. He stubbornly insisted that Vance was currently in New York securing a vital, multi-million-dollar bridge loan that would completely save the company by Friday. You just can't stand that I built something actually real, can you? Julian spat, stepping incredibly aggressively into my personal space. You have to invent these ridiculous, fictional hacker conspiracy theories to make your pathetic life feel somewhat important. Vance is my brother in the trenches. You're just a massive, ongoing disappointment. He grabbed his desk phone and immediately called building security to physically escort me out of the lobby. As the heavy glass doors of the building closed forcefully behind me, a profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. I realized that trying to be the nice, supportive little brother was completely useless. His towering pride was going to get him permanently locked in a federal cage. If he refused to let me save him, I would have to utterly destroy him. I returned to my cramped basement apartment, locked the heavy deadbolt, and immediately told Maya we were violently changing our entire operational strategy. We turned our messy living room into a fully functioning digital war room. We covered the walls with printed, highly detailed flowcharts, bank routing numbers, and Vance's complete, incredibly shady corporate history. If Julian was going to survive this catastrophic betrayal, I had to completely remove his personal agency from the situation. I had to orchestrate a massive, hostile takeover of his ruined life before the federal government could freeze everything he owned. The first, incredibly painful phase of the plan was absolutely the hardest, doing exactly nothing. Maya and I had to sit back and quietly watch my brother willingly walk directly into the federal slaughterhouse. I monitored the internal company servers continuously as Vance smoothly initiated the final, massive transfer of the remaining liquid assets, draining the final drop of lifeblood from the corporation. It was emotionally agonizing to witness. Every single time my phone rang, I terrifiedly expected it to be my mother crying, telling me Julian had been arrested by the FBI. I knew Vance deeply needed Julian to completely hit absolute rock bottom, so the con artist would feel totally secure in his victory and completely finalize his own exit strategy. During those agonizing weeks, Julian grew increasingly, visibly desperate. He started quietly selling off his expensive luxury watches, his vintage wine collection, absolutely anything to keep the lights on while he foolishly waited for Vance's mythical bridge loan. He alienated everyone, lashing out violently at our parents and cutting off all contact with me entirely. I watched his digital footprint rapidly shrink as his premium credit cards were systematically canceled by the unforgiving banks. He was drowning, thrashing wildly in the incredibly dark, freezing water. The guilt of letting him suffer was heavy, but I knew it was the only way to spring the trap I was carefully building. We sat in the dark, glowing light of the monitors, waiting for his final collapse. The absolutely inevitable collapse finally happened on a cold, rainy Tuesday morning, and the public fallout was spectacularly, brutally devastating. The prominent financial news networks aggressively broke the massive story just after dawn. Julian's tech logistics company had its corporate operational accounts permanently frozen by federal financial regulators. 2 hours later, a fleet of black government SUVs completely surrounded his corporate headquarters, and heavily armed IRS agents rapidly raided the building. They were seen carrying out heavy boxes of physical hard drives, employee laptops, and paper ledgers. The company he built was entirely dismantled in mere hours. Julian was physically locked out of his own building, standing completely frozen on the wet sidewalk in the pouring rain as eager photographers snapped relentless pictures of his absolute, undeniable ruin. True to form, Vance immediately launched his highly pre-planned, incredibly slick exit strategy. He actively appeared on a prominent financial news broadcast that very afternoon, looking appropriately, deeply devastated. Vance played the highly sympathetic, totally blindsided partner to absolute perfection. He tearfully claimed on live television that he was utterly sickened by Julian's gross financial mismanagement and deeply hidden, severe gambling addictions, a total lie fabricated to cover the missing funds. He completely threw my brother to the hungry, waiting wolves. Julian was instantly facing multiple severe federal fraud charges, massive civil lawsuits, and total, inescapable personal bankruptcy. His wealthy Ivy League friends abandoned him immediately. His beautiful, highly demanding fiancée quietly packed her bags and permanently left his expensive penthouse the next morning without leaving a single note. He wouldn't answer calls from our parents. He was completely, devastatingly broken, desperately pacing his empty apartment and terrifyingly waiting for the federal handcuffs. I sat in my dark basement, silently watching the live, continuous news coverage of my brother's highly public professional execution. I didn't feel any joy or sick vindication watching the arrogant golden child violently fall from grace. I only felt a cold, incredibly calculated determination. The poison bait had been fully swallowed, and Vance was actively celebrating his massive victory, completely unaware of the invisible digital snare wrapping tightly around his ankles. It was finally time to initiate the most vindictive phase of my deeply twisted master plan. Most people don't know this, but when I was 18, I used my freelance cybersecurity bounties to aggressively buy a significant amount of a highly obscure, highly volatile cryptocurrency. I stubbornly held on to it for years while absolutely everyone aggressively called it a foolish, worthless scam. A few years ago, that obscure coin violently exploded in value, leaving me quietly, independently, massively wealthy. I never told my family because I didn't want their relentless, exhausting judgment to suddenly shift into relentless, exhausting demands for loans. Now, that completely hidden wealth was my primary, incredibly powerful weapon. Maya and I aggressively mobilized our financial resources. We legally registered a heavily shielded, practically untraceable dummy corporation in Delaware called Aegis Holdings. Through a highly paid team of incredibly aggressive corporate lawyers who specialized entirely in distressed assets, Aegis Holdings swooped directly into the chaotic aftermath of Julian's financial implosion. We moved with absolutely terrifying, unstoppable speed. Because Julian's various creditors were utterly panicked by the impending, massive federal indictments, they were desperately eager to offload his incredibly toxic debt. Aegis Holdings quietly bought up all of Julian's defaulted personal loans, his massive high-interest credit card debt, the expensive collateral on his leased sports cars, and the primary mortgage on his massive downtown penthouse. We legally bought the immense debt for literal pennies on the dollar, assuming total, undeniable legal control over his entire life. Simultaneously, my ruthless lawyers aggressively purchased the heavily discounted, remaining liquid assets of the logistics company directly from the overwhelmed bankruptcy courts. To the outside corporate world, Aegis Holdings looked exactly like a ruthless, highly predatory vulture fund gleefully picking the meat off a dying corporate carcass. Absolutely no one knew that the mysterious billionaire actively funding the highly hostile takeover was actually the messy, heavily judged kid in the basement. Within 72 short hours of the initial government raid, the incredibly aggressive legal paperwork was officially finalized and permanently filed with the appropriate courts. I now legally owned everything my brother had ever valued, including his ridiculous luxury penthouse. Exactly one agonizing week after the devastating IRS raid, Julian received a formal, aggressively worded legal summons. He was heavily ordered to legally appear at a neutral, incredibly expensive downtown legal office to permanently meet with the primary executive representative of Aegis Holdings, his new mysterious, overwhelming majority creditor. Vance was also legally compelled to strictly attend the meeting as the remaining corporate partner to officially sign over the final, legally binding dissolution papers. Maya and I quickly arrived at the high-rise legal office an hour early, carefully setting up our encrypted laptops and external hard drives at the head of the massive, glass-walled boardroom. When the heavy oak doors finally opened, Julian slowly walked in first. He looked exactly like an absolute, terrifying ghost. He had lost at least 10 pounds. His extremely expensive suit hung incredibly loosely on his frail frame, and his trademark arrogance had been entirely, completely replaced by hollow, profoundly terrified exhaustion. Vance confidently sauntered in right behind him, wearing a smug, barely concealed evil smile, clearly eager to watch Julian completely sign his life away so he could flee to his tropical sanctuary in the Caymans. Julian didn't even look up from the shiny floor as he approached the large mahogany table. He pulled out a heavy chair, his pale hands trembling violently. "I'm here," Julian quietly whispered to the table, his voice completely broken and deeply defeated. "Just give me the damn papers." I slowly stood up from my leather executive chair at the far head of the long table, stepping out from the dim shadows of the room, holding the massive manila folder containing the legal deeds to his total ruin. "Hello, Julian," I said, my voice echoing incredibly loudly in the incredibly silent room. Julian's heavy head snapped up aggressively. When his completely exhausted eyes finally focused entirely on me, standing there in my faded hoodie, the intense confusion on his face was profoundly deep. Then, the intense confusion slowly morphed into sheer, unadulterated, unimaginable terror. He suddenly realized his loser little brother was the faceless billionaire holding the executioner's heavy axe. I firmly decided to cruelly let him actively suffer in the terrifying, deeply humiliating illusion for just a few minutes longer. I absolutely needed to completely shatter his incredibly toxic pride before I could properly, permanently rebuild him. I violently slammed the extremely heavy manila folder onto the direct center of the polished mahogany table. The shockingly sharp sound made Julian physically, visibly flinch. I slowly opened the thick cover, deliberately pulling out the aggressively stamped legal deeds, property titles, and massive debt transfers one by one. I laid them out perfectly like a winning hand of playing cards. "Aegis Holdings," I announced incredibly coldly, making absolute sure my harsh voice carried across the dead silent room. "We bought your incredibly toxic defaulted mortgage, Julian. I legally own your massive downtown penthouse. I own the expensive titles to your leased Italian sports cars. I own the absolute rights to the millions of dollars in outstanding personal debt you stupidly, blindly guaranteed for this totally bankrupt company." I aggressively leaned forward, resting my palms heavily on the cool glass of the table, staring directly and deeply into his utterly terrified, completely bloodshot eyes. "Remember when you loudly told Mom I was a completely worthless parasite? Remember when you viciously laughed at my fake internet job? Well, my fake internet money just aggressively bought your entire, pathetic reality for literal, actual pennies. You are completely, absolutely at my mercy." Vance leaned far back in his expensive leather chair, practically vibrating with incredibly wicked, deeply twisted amusement. He tightly crossed his arms and loudly smirked at me, clearly, immensely enjoying the deeply petty, highly destructive family drama. He entirely thought I was just a violently bitter, deeply vindictive little brother taking a brutal, totally unnecessary victory lap over my older sibling's freshly, deeply dug grave. Julian didn't passionately argue. He didn't violently yell. The fierce fight had been completely, utterly drained out of his exhausted soul. He just stared blankly at the highly legally binding papers, aggressively proving that the brother he hated had flawlessly engineered his absolute, total destruction. Julian closed his eyes, completely broken, as a single tear rolled down his pale, exhausted cheek. The incredibly profound, completely suffocating silence in the expansive boardroom was incredibly heavy, practically pulling all the oxygen from the room. I quietly watched Julian's chest heave with utterly silent, incredibly agonizing sobs. He had completely hit absolute rock bottom, entirely stripped of his massive ego, his stolen money, and his pristine, highly arrogant armor. He was finally, truly ready. I took a very deep, highly steadying breath and completely dropped my intensely cold, highly vindictive facade. My aggressive posture instantly softened, and I deeply looked at my incredibly ruined brother with genuine, incredibly heartbreaking pity. "But here is the incredibly important thing about my fake internet skills, Julian," I said, my voice suddenly incredibly gentle, highly supportive, and quiet. I quickly picked up a small black remote from the table and immediately hit a single button. The large projector screen on the back wall behind me instantly blinked brightly to life. The massive screen didn't show Julian's terrible debts. It clearly displayed a massive, highly detailed digital flowchart aggressively mapping dozens of highly hidden offshore bank accounts securely located in the Cayman Islands. At the exact center of the complex web was Vance's smiling, incredibly arrogant face. The highly smug smirk instantly vanished entirely from Vance's pale face, immediately replaced by a horrifying mask of pure, totally unadulterated panic. He bolted completely upright in his leather chair. Aegis Holdings didn't just aggressively buy your toxic debt. I quickly explained to Julian, who was intensely staring at the bright screen in total, absolute shock. While Vance was incredibly busy aggressively framing you for massive tax fraud, Maya and I successfully hacked directly into his highly secured offshore shell corporations. We legally acquired the exclusive holding rights to the dummy companies he actively used to hide the stolen funds. We aggressively drained every single stolen cent entirely back into Aegis, and we immediately forwarded the absolute, undeniable proof of his malicious embezzlement directly to the federal authorities. I quickly gathered the highly aggressive legal deeds from the table, placed them safely back into the manila folder, and walked entirely around the mahogany table. I slid the main folder toward my stunned brother and told him he was completely safe. Before the utterly panicked Vance could even wildly attempt to desperately formulate a highly coherent lie, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom burst violently open. Two senior federal agents in dark, highly official suits walked in extremely quickly, followed incredibly closely by the building's armed security team. Maya had incredibly perfectly timed the anonymous FBI tip-off, aggressively handing them a meticulously wrapped digital bow containing the absolute, highly undeniable proof of Vance's entire, massive criminal conspiracy. Vance wildly, aggressively tried to push violently past the huge agents, his highly slick veneer completely, totally shattered into a million pieces, but he was instantly slammed extremely hard against the thick glass wall and violently, permanently handcuffed. As they aggressively dragged the incredibly loudly screaming, viciously cursing con artist directly out of the room, Julian remained absolutely, completely frozen in his leather chair. He incredibly slowly looked deeply down at the thick manila folder I had gently placed directly in front of him. Inside were the totally clean deeds to his massive penthouse, his expensive cars, and his completely restored company, legally transferred entirely back to his given name, completely free of any malicious debt. He slowly looked deeply up at me, his completely bloodshot eyes incredibly wide with a highly profound, completely earth-shattering realization. He finally, truly understood the absolutely massive, incredible scale of what had strictly just happened. His loser, little brother hadn't spent the last entire month aggressively orchestrating a highly hostile takeover to permanently destroy him. I had aggressively spent my own highly hidden fortune and endless, totally sleepless nights building an impenetrable, multi-million-dollar legal fortress to miraculously save him from 20 absolutely brutal years in a federal penitentiary. The truly immense, crushing weight of his incredibly severe previous cruelty, beautifully combined with the incredibly staggering relief of his total salvation, finally broke the massive dam. Julian collapsed completely over the table, violently burying his face deeply in his hands, and began weeping totally uncontrollably. He aggressively kept repeating the incredibly desperate words, "I'm so sorry," over and over, his voice desperately muffled by his shaking, exhausted hands. I walked over, placed my hand firmly on his violently shaking shoulder, and gently let him cry. I finally hugged my older brother for the first time in over a bitter decade. It has been exactly 6 incredibly transformative months since that highly dramatic morning in the massive downtown boardroom, and our entire lives have completely transformed in ways I never thought possible. Vance is currently heavily sitting in a maximum security federal holding facility, violently fighting a massive, totally undeniable mountain of irrefutable fraud charges that will highly likely keep him permanently locked in a cage for the absolute rest of his natural life. Julian's massive logistics company is incredibly slowly but highly steadily recovering from the absolute, massive financial trauma, totally thanks to the successfully recovered offshore funds and the incredibly swift, highly public clearing of his total name by the deeply apologetic federal regulators. But the absolute biggest change entirely isn't highly financial. It's incredibly deeply personal. Julian is a fundamentally, entirely different human being. The highly arrogant, intensely tightly wound corporate machine completely died the exact day he truly realized his entire, massive life was completely saved by the exact unconventional skills he used to ruthlessly, relentlessly mock. He actively sold the absolutely ridiculous sports cars, completely downsized his incredibly excessive lifestyle, and actually permanently started treating our highly supportive parents with genuine, absolute respect. Last week, he surprisingly took me out for a casual dinner at a totally normal, highly reasonably priced burger joint. I aggressively wore my favorite, slightly stained faded gray hoodie, and for the exact first time in my entire, highly judged life, my older brother absolutely didn't make a single deeply sarcastic comment about my casual clothes. Instead, he incredibly humbly asked me if I would highly consider officially signing on as the absolute head of cybersecurity for his massively rebuilding firm, heavily offering me a totally incredible salary that made my jaw practically hit the highly stained floor. I casually told him I would heavily think about it, strictly provided I could still absolutely work from my highly chaotic, incredibly messy basement. True brotherhood absolutely isn't about perfectly matching someone's highly rigid expectations or aggressively building the exact same kind of traditional, corporate wealth. It's about showing up entirely with a heavy shield when the hungry wolves are actively at the door. Never underestimate the quiet ones in the basement, because we might just save your damn life.